Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. Starting here. So we're on page 274 in the books. We're talking about squeezing absorbed liquid out of food, i.e. where the liquid was not part of the food to begin with, but so it's not inherently part of the food, but nonetheless you want to separate it. So source number 41 says the Gemara like this. Okay. Kvashim shesachtan amar rav legufan mutar lememehen patur aval asur shlakot ben legufan ben lememehen mutar. So here we're talking about either pickled foods or cooked foods, right? Kvashim, pickled vegetables, for example. So says Rav, if you were to squeeze them legufan mutar, here the question of kavanah is going to be very, very important. If you are squeezing them in order to, you don't want the food to have lots of juice on, you want to eat the pickles, but without the juice, whatever. So it's for the sake of the pickles, that would be mutar. That is allowed, according to Rav. If you want to get the juice, right, and you want to, you enjoy the eating that for whatever reason, so then that is going to be forbidden. It says patur aval asur, i.e. it is an isur derabanan. The reason it's an isur derabanan is because we aren't dealing with zaytim or anavim, we're dealing with other foods. Okay, that is the opinion of Rav. And then he says, but shlakot, regarding cooked foods, okay, boiled vegetables, for example, ben negufan, ben mehen, muta. Over there, he says it's going to be allowed, permitted regardless. So that is opinion number one. Opinion number two in the Gemara is Shmuel. Shmuel amar echad zeh ve'echad zeh, whether he does not make a distinction between boiled or pickled, but either way, he says legufan mutar, lememehen patur aval asur. Again, if you're squeezing it for the sake of the food itself, and this is different to the discussion we had previously. The discussion we had previously was whereby I'm squeezing the juice because I want the juice, but if the juice is going directly onto food, then I relate to the juice as food. Here, I'm not talking about the juice. Here, I'm talking about if I want the food, okay? So then I just want the food to be dry. So that, he says, is mutar. If it's lememehen, but it's for the juice, for the liquid, so patur aval asur. Says Shmuel, that's going to be an isur d'Rabanan. And opinion number three is Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan amar echad kvashim ve'echad shlakot. Okay, legufan mutar, lememehen chayav chatat. So Rabbi Yochanan is similar to Shmuel. He says, again, either way, if you want it for the food itself, that is going to be permitted. But the difference is, if it's for the juice, that is going to be not just an isur d'Rabanan, that is going to be an isur d'oraita. So who do we paskin like? The Tosfot over here, in source number 42. Tosfot says Rabbi Yochanan Polish. Okay, we have a principle when we have a machloket between Rav, Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan, we paskin like him as opposed to Rav or Shmuel. However, other Rishonim say it's a little bit more complicated because there are a number of different parameters here, and we basically go by the majority view. Have a look at the Rif in source number 43. He writes like this. He says, in this case, we don't paskin like Rabbi Yochanan here. In other words, it's never going to be, in this case, it's not going to be an isur d'oraita. Because Rav and Shmuel agree, meaning when I have what the Tosfos was referring to, and to get a little bit technical for a moment, but if I have a machloket between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, or Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, so then I can say I paskin like Rabbi Yochanan. But where Rav and Shmuel, although there's three opinions here, where Rav and Shmuel both agree versus Rabbi Yochanan, so then it's not so simple. So they both agree, they have a different distinction between them, but they both agree that it's not an isur d'oraita, and therefore we would paskin like them regarding that question. That is what we learned last week. Rav and Shmuel both hold that you would only have an isur d'oraita of schita when it comes to zaytim and anavim. Therefore, no isur d'oraita here. And therefore, when Rabbi Yochanan comes and he says it's an isur d'oraita, he's a yachid versus Rabbim, and therefore we don't paskin like him regarding the odd. Okay. Now, regarding the fact that it's going to be asur, at least when it comes to shlakot, when it comes to cooked foods, so both Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan agree versus Rav. Rav was the one who was more lenient in that regard. So therefore we paskin like Shmuel regarding that. In other words, says the Rif, Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan basically hold the same thing, The only difference is whether it's an Isur D'Rabbanan or an Isur D'Oraita. But regarding Mutar and Asur, we paskin like them. And therefore, we don't make a distinction between cooked food, boiled foods, or pickled foods. But essentially what we're saying is like this. What comes out is, if you're taking food now which has got liquid attached to it, we'll talk about oil in a moment. Talk about, let's say you fry something and there's lots of oil, schnitzel, whatever it is, and it's got lots of oil, you're allowed to squeeze out the oil. So if it's for the sake of the food itself, we're allowed to squeeze out the liquid. I have no interest in the liquid at all. I just want the food. If it's for the sake of the liquid, that would be forbidden. Again, this is in distinction to what we spoke about last week, where the juice, the liquid, is intrinsically part of the food itself, where it's not so simple. So let's see the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch source number 44 at the bottom of page 275. He says, "Lischot kvashim perush." Pickled vegetables to squeeze them, ushlakot or cooked vegetables, boiled vegetables. If you're squeezing it for the sake of the food itself, you don't want the juice or anything like that. You just want the food to be dry in order to improve it. Even if you're squeezing it into an empty bowl, that is permitted. But if you're squeezing it for the juice, so then you could squeeze onto food, as we've learned already. But if it's an empty bowl, there's no food, then it would be forbidden. We saw Rabbeinu Hananel was stringent last week, and he was stringent this week as well. So therefore, according to his opinion, the Shulchan Aruch brings it. It's a minority opinion, but Rabbeinu Hananel is a significant posek, so he brings it here as a dissenting view that if you wanted the juice, even if you would squeeze it onto food, because that is Rabbeinu Hananel's opinion, that could be even still a chayav chatat isur d'oraita. Okay. So the Mishnah Berurah at the top of the next page in source number 45, he says, "Agav deshal peirot mutar lischot." Okay, even though we've already learned that there are fruits, which I said in the introduction, nowadays it's difficult to find an example of this. But in theory, if you had a fruit which you would never have its juice, so then you could squeeze it. Sorry. He says, he says, if you had a fruit which you were never interested in drinking the juice, so that is not going to be, that's not actually called juice. That's just called part of the fruit. And therefore that would always be permitted, theoretically. Whereas here, here, the liquid was always liquid to begin with, before it was attached to the food. As we saw, would still not be any Isur D'Oraita, that is only Zaitim and Anavim. So therefore, if, for example, you have lettuce that you've washed and you are unable to dry the lettuce before Shabbat, so here says the Mishnah Berurah, you could squeeze the lettuce to get the water off, because you're not interested in the water, you're only interested in the lettuce. Okay, Yalkut Yosef, source number 47 at the bottom. He says, "Perot yrakot hakvushim b'chometz or b'mei melach v'chein yrakot shlukim mutar l'sochdam b'shabbat letoch ke'al rika." Right? That's just reinforcing what we've said. You could squeeze the food if you just want the food to be dry. You could squeeze to an empty bowl. You're not interested in the liquid, or you could squeeze it onto food, even if you are interested in the liquid. Okay, and finally, the Ochot Shabbat source number 48, I mentioned, what if you have very, very oily food, which has been fried? He says, Davar ma'achal shenitgan o nitbashav u'safuk b'shemen o b'lotev. So food that's been fried or cooked and it's filled with oil or sauce, dino, she'im ba lesochto letzorch shimush b'shemen o b'lotev asvugim bo alei ze asur. You really like the sauce and you want to extract all the sauce and squeeze it, so that would be forbidden. However, im kavanato letzorch achila, but if you just don't want so much oil on your schnitzel or your latkes or whatever, that would be permitted. Okay, so that is the hashlama regarding squeezing absorbed liquids out of food. And that brings us on to the next shiur. So you have to skip a few pages over here. We get to page 291, but we're now on to the next malacha, We're working our way through the 39 melachot. We finished 2. Okay, we're up to melechet borer. We're not going to go through all 39. Don't worry. But so borer is also a very, very practical melacha. This comes up in every Shabbos kitchen. This comes up at every Shabbos table. But for example, when I'm eating, when I'm sitting and eating my Shabbos meal, so can I take the meat away from the bones, and I'm eating the chicken or the fish, or take the bones away from the meat? That is going to be a question of borer. It's a question that comes up if you have skin on the food and you don't like the skin, or you want to separate that. That's a question of borer. Peeling vegetables, right? Serving up the soup, right? What happens when you have the pot of chicken soup? Okay, but one kid only likes the carrots, and one kid only likes the onions, and one kid won't eat the onions. So when it's a bit of a lottery every time you're serving up the bowl. Are you allowed to, if I dish up the ladle and there's an onion inside, am I allowed to get rid of the onion? Am I allowed to get rid of the carrot, etc.? So these are some of the questions that come up. There are many more. I'm sure you're all thinking ahead. So as we did with Menechet Bishul, we're going to go through. We're going to learn the basic conditions first. We're going to learn the principles. It's going to take some time. And then once we understand the Ekronot, we can go and look at some of the more practical cases, and hopefully come up with the answers. So, Melechet Borer, page 291. We're starting the numbering again. So we're on source number 1. Source number 1 is the Gemara Shabbat, which says, Tanu Rabbanan, Hayu lefanav minay ochlin, Borer v'ochel, borer moniach. By the way, again, just about all of the discussions when it comes to Melechet Borer, in the Gemara are relating to food. There's also a question: do we have borer when it's not related to food? For example, if I'm setting the table and I have the cutlery and I have the knives and the forks, etc., and setting them away, or this question comes up if you play card games in Shabbos, for example, sorting the cards. There are many different applications. There are poskim who write that borer only applies to food, but the consensus view seems to be that it would apply to other things as well. In any event. So it says the Gemara, and this is quite a cryptic braita. So a person has a number of foods in front of him. Borer v'ochel, borer umoniach v'lo yivro. V'im birer chayav chatat. Okay, and then, understandably, the Gemara says, "My kama." Says, "What are you talking about? This doesn't really." It seems to be somewhat contradictory. It says, "So you have a number of different foods before you. Borer v'ochel, you can sort and eat." In other words, that sounds like it's saying you're allowed to take that which you want to eat. That's the sorting that you're doing. And then it says borer umoniach, but you can sort to set something aside. So that seems to be the opposite. And then it says v'lo yivro. It says actually don't sort at all. V'im birer chayav chatat. And if you did, this is an isur d'oraita. Okay, so very, very confusing. My kamar, what is the Gemara talking about? So the Gemara proceeds to give 5 distinctions. Clearly, what the Braita is telling us is that there is a case of borer which is permitted. In other words, there's a case which is not considered to be borer, and there's a case of borer which is going to be forbidden, which is the melacha. And our question is, in what format, what am I doing where it's not actually considered? Let's call it derech borer. It's considered something else. So the Gemara gives 5 answers. The first 2 answers are not brought in the source that you have in front of you. Those 2 answers are ultimately rejected la halacha, so we won't go into them. But there are 3 answers which, although the Gemara really accepts the final one as the resolution for this paraita, it does not reject the other 2. In other words, when it comes to halacha l'maaseh, we have a machloket as to what exactly the Braita is talking about, but we seem to accept, and based on other Gemaras that we'll see, we seem to accept all 3 of these reasons la halacha as follows. So the top of page 292 again is, what is the case of borer v'ochel, where you're allowed to do borer, it's not considered the melacha, and what is the case where we say lo yivro v'im birer chayav chatat, that you cannot, and that would be an isur d'oraita. So answer number 1, which is actually answer number 3, but again, it's 3 of 5 that are in the Gemara, but it's 1 of 3 that we're going through, which are the ones that are accepted lehalacha. So top of page 292. El amar of Yosef, borer v'ochel beyad, borer umoniach beyad. So he says, where we say it's permitted is where I'm sorting or selecting something by hand, with my hand. I'm not using a specialized implement in order to select or to sift, etc. So he says, so he explains, if you have a kanon, which is a type of a basket, or a tamchay, which is sort of a large plate, these are both flat vessels, which flat vessels, which you would use to sort large amounts of, think of rice or kitniot or things like that. So there, if you were to use those, he says that would be patur avalasur. That would be borer derabanan. Ubenapal bikvara. Now we're talking about a sieve or a sifter, something which is a much more specialized implement for sorting. So that lo yivovim chayav chatat. That would be a sudoraita. So then says the Gemara, Matkif Rav Himnuna, midei kanon v'tam choiktane. So Rav Himnuna says, no, that's not what the Braita is talking about, because it just said borer. It didn't make any distinction between whether you're using a kanon or a tam or not. So he's going to give a different explanation here for the Gemara. But again, this is the first distinction that we see, that there's a difference between borer when it's with my hands or when it's with a specialized sorting implement. Okay, so answer number 2 is that Amar Rav Himnuna, borer v'ochel mitoch hapsolet. Borer umeniach ochel mitoch hapsolet. Psolet mitoch ha'ochel lo yivovim v'chayav chatat. So he says the question here is, when I'm sorting, what am I taking? Am I sorting the ochel from the psolet? Am I taking the food from the waste? I'm not really sorting and leaving it behind. I'm taking out that which I want, that which I wish to eat. So if I have a mixture of nuts and shells, right? So I'm taking out the nuts that I want to eat and I'm leaving the shells behind. That would be okay. But if it's the other way around, if I'm taking the psolet from the ochel, right? I'm removing the shells. That is, I'm sorting. That would be forbidden. In other words, the understanding here is that so long as that it's derech achila, as it's what I'm doing is I'm not sorting, but I'm eating. That's the way that I'm eating. That would be allowed, but the other way around would be forbidden. We'll get into what happens if I have a mixture which is not ochel and psolet necessarily, but maybe it's 2 types of ochel, it's 2 types of food. Do I consider one type to be food and the other type to be waste? But here he's talking about clearly one is food and one is waste. So then I want the food. Okay. But then Matkiv Abaye, midei ochel mitoch psolet tani. So again, Abaye rejects that. He says that's not what it says in the Braita. Fine. And Amar Abaye, borer v'ochel la'altar, uborer umeniach la'altar. So Abaye explains the time dimension. He says, if you are sorting it now for immediate use, and we have to discuss what is immediate use. Is this immediate or is this Jewish time, right? But it's immediate, it's for now, so that would be permitted. But if I'm sorting it to, leave it for later, even later on, lebor bayom, even later on in the same day, and to leave it in storage, that would be forbidden. Now says the Gemara at the end, after all these explanations, Nachmani is a name for another name which Abaye is known. So he says Abaye was correct. I.e., we accept number 3, that the distinction is between la'altar and lebor bayom, whether it's for immediate use or for later use. But as I said, the previous two criteria are not rejected l'halacha. We have a number of other cases in the Gemara, all round about the same daf, that indicates that we do bring these into consideration. Look at source number 2. It says, Hayu lefanav shnei minei ochalin. Again, this is also from the Gemara. Ubilel v'achal, ubilel v'iniach. So I have 2 types of food in front of me. Okay, we sort one side. We sort one type to eat. Ubilel v'iniach, and we sort one type to put aside. Rav Ashi matni patur, Rav Yirmiyah difti matni chayav. Okay, so yeah, we have machloket. Rav Ashi says patur. Patur seemingly is patur avalasur. Okay, and Rav Yirmiyah says chayav. So Ashi matni patur. So we have a contradiction here. So says the Gemara, top page 293, lo kasha, ha b'kanon v'tamchoi, ha b'napa b'kvara. So yeah, we see a distinction between these different types of kelim, whether it's a specialized kli, which is for sorting, that would be an isur doraita, and where it's a less specialized kli, but nonetheless you're using that vessel in order to sort, that would be an isur drabanan. Then we see case number 3. Chizki Amar, haborer turmusim mitoch psolet shelahen chayav. Okay, so Chizki says one who sorts lupines. I'm sure everybody had lupines for the Shabbos lunch yesterday. Okay, this is a type of legume, a type of bean. But if you would sort that, you're sorting the food from the. So these Tumusim mitoch psolet shelahen chayav. Yeah, you would be liable. So Lema Kazvach is ochel mitoch psolet asur. So Shani took this Tumusim the shakle le shiva zimni v'lo shakle le masach v'kipsolet mitoch ochel dami. In other words, the Gemara explains that there is something, lupines are very, very there's a lot of effort that needs to go into cooking them, etc. It's a special category, but the implication is, generally speaking, if you're separating the ochel from the psolet, generally speaking, you're separating the food from the waste. That is permitted. That is not considered borah. So what we see, we have three conditions, and essentially the Shulchan Aruch tells us, based on the Rambam, that we need all three conditions. When we have all three conditions, then it would not be considered borah. Let's read the Rambam. He says, okay, so if I separate, so he says, if you separate food from waste, or if you have two types of food and we're separating one from the other, okay, again, we'll get into the distinction between those two. So if you're using a kli, it's going to be forbidden. If you separated it with your hand in order to eat immediately, that is permitted. So what we see is, in order for it to be permitted, we need all three conditions. It has to be ochel mitoch psolet. I need to be separating the food from the waste. I have to be taking out that which I want to eat. I have to be doing that with my hand. We'll discuss in a moment what my hand means. And it has to be done for immediate use, not for later on. I need all three conditions. It's an and, in order for it to be permitted. If one of those conditions is lacking, just one, then it's going to be asur. You can see the Shulchan Aruch in source number 5. He says essentially the same thing. Okay, so let's talk about the conditions one by one. Let's first talk about immediate use, miyad. Okay, top of page 295. So what does l'altar mean? This is not completely clear, and it may be dependent on the context. Source number 6, Rabbeinu Chananel says l'altar damay Abaye. So long as you're sitting on the table and eating. And what we see from here, and a number of the Rishonim and a number of the Achronim understand, that alta means during the course of the meal. So it doesn't mean immediately or in the next few seconds or in the next few minutes, but I'm doing it for the meal that I'm currently eating. That may be considered la'alta. Says the Rama, source number 7, he says, Kol ma sheboleh letzorech uta suda shemesef ba miyad mikre la'alta. Anything that I'm doing for the meal that I'm about to sit down to, we all know how it is. On Shabbos afternoon, a meal can take 3 hours or 4 hours, right? Whatever it is. So if right at the beginning of the meal, I'm separating something, that's for dessert. That's still part of the meal. That would be okay. It would be considered miyad according to this. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kol ma sheboleh רצונו לומר, אפילו יאריך זמן הסעודה כמה שעות, מקרה לאלתר, כיוון שהברירה הוא סמוך לסעודה. Even if the meal is going to be a number of hours, so long as I'm doing it just before the meal, that is okay. So now the question becomes, how long, if I'm now before the meal, it takes 2 hours or 3 hours, whatever, to set up the meal. Okay, this could be relevant if it's a kiddush or if it's at home or whatever it is. What's considered part of that, or what's considered immediate? So let's see page 296 at the top. The Igra Moshe in source number 9. He says, "Ita bagad Mordechai b'meili, delaniach la'achar sha'a have kabore lotzar v'chen b'shulchan aruch." So we find a number of the poskim, the language they say laniach la'achar sha'a. Often it gets very, very confusing. When we find, what does sha'a mean? Sha'a means, nowadays, means an hour. An hour is 60 minutes, right? We're not talking about shots manual. But often sha'a means that time, right? That setting. So Ramosha says, sha'a does not mean literally 60 minutes. So he was asked, Ha'im pachot misha'a shel 60 minut. 60 minutes. Chashiv kabore lo'ochel la'alta. Does that mean, and this could be l'chumra and l'kula, right? Meaning, do I say, let's say I'm not sitting at the meal now, but I want to have it later, but it's going to be less than an hour does that mean it's still considered immediate? So he says like this: En sha'a zo shel shiur sha'a. אלא זמן שהדרך הוא לאישה זו שמסדרת האוכלים לסעודה. Okay, the person who was asking, it means the amount of time that it takes to prepare the meal. That's what we mean here when we say שעה. קודם לזה אפילו שעה קטנה אסור. But if it's less than that, even a short amount of time would not be permitted. So look at source number 10. This is from the Grey Book of Rabbi, the 39 Melachot. He says it's permitted to do the borer activities any time during the entire course of the preparation, even though the selected items will not be used until much later in the meal, because the entire process of preparing and conducting the meal is considered miyad. This holds true even if the preparation includes non-borer activities as well as borer activities. In other words, when I say the time that it takes you to set up the meal, we don't mean the time that it takes you to perform this particular activity. The entire setting up of the meal, that's considered miyad. So a person's in the midst of, he says, example, the meal requires numerous preparations. You need to set the tables, you need to make the place settings, peel the vegetables. As I said, peeling vegetables, for example, could very well be a question of borer and other cases as well. Chopping liver, peeling, mashing eggs, bringing wine, cold drinks to the table, etc. All of these activities are considered part of the preparation, and all of the time needed for them is considered miyad, even though many of them are not borer related. So as long as we're in the period, it's a normal period of setting up for the meal, that is considered miyad, even though I'm still not going to eat for an hour or two or whatever that may be. That is considered miyad. I just have to share a story I saw yesterday, which is, some of you may have seen this, it was going around. But we talk about how long it takes to set up a meal. There was a certain community somewhere where there was a bar mitzvah yesterday, and they were having a kiddush. You thought we had problems with the kiddush yesterday, so it was very nice. But they had the family is waiting. It's the caterers are meant to come however many hours before to set everything up, and it's half an hour before the end of shul, and the caterer hasn't arrived. Okay, so it seems to be apparently the caterer was somewhere local, so somebody went, knocks on the door. The caterer had written down for this that this bar mitzvah was next week, so they weren't doing anything. So what do? You're in shul. You've got half an hour to go. This is miyad. There's no question. And there was apparently, and again, I don't know which community this is. I know which city it was in Israel, but an amazing story. So the whole community galvanized. I don't know. Again, I don't know if they left shul early or they didn't listen to the drasha or whatever. But apparently people started running home, and this one brought nuts, and this one brought cakes, and this one brought whatever. They all brought what they had at home. And apparently people went into the kiddush and said, wow, this is so nice. You've gone, we've never had a kiddush like this. Which caterer did you use? So the caterer, I'm sure, had what to pay afterwards. But that was the story. So sometimes it can be done in a very, very short period of time. But generally speaking, we have our preparation time, right, number of hours, and all that is considered miyad. Okay. Fine. Let's see. Chazon Avadia on source number 11. He says a little bit differently to Rav Moshe. He says, "Nir'eh delashon sha'a lav dafka el azman ma." So he agrees, where it says sha'a does not mean literally 60 minutes. V'kach katav v'shutigot Moshe. Mikom makom. נראה שאם בני הבית מרובים וצריך זמן ניכר לבורת מאכלם וכן בסעודות גדולות, מותר להתחיל לברור תוך חצי שעה קודם הסעודה. So he says half an hour before you can start preparing. גם בספר חוט שני כתב בשם חזון איש שרק בתוך חצי שעה סמוך לסעודה חשיב לאלתר. וסיים, ומי האוכל בסעודתו אכילה מועטת, אינו להכין אלא סמוך לסעודה ממש כ5 דקות קודם, ולא חצי שעה קודם. In other words, so what he says is like this. Why he says specifically half an hour, I don't know. But he says you have the time before that you need to prepare. But if, let's say now, you have a smaller meal and it's just a family, you don't actually need all that time before, so then that would not be considered miyad. It's only the time that you need that's when you should start preparing. Okay. But again, Shema Shabbat Kelchata over here, I won't read it inside, but he says essentially the same principle, which is you need a little bit of longer time. So a person doesn't have to say, oh, well, I'm going to only start preparing 10 minutes before because, so that it will be considered miyad, even though you actually need more time. Whatever is the usual amount of time, then when we need to prepare for the meal beforehand, that is considered miyad. Okay, the Mishnah Berurah writes, again, not to exaggerate with this. He this seif is written not in the context of melechet borer. It's in the context of melechet tochen, which is grinding, which we'll discuss in a later share as well. But one of the applications of tochen, although grinding, is making anything into very, very small pieces. So chopping up vegetables very small for salad, for example. And over there, but tochen, one of the leniencies also is miyad, if it's done immediately. So he explains, he says, Mikom makom hanoagim, stop the next page, source 13. Mikom makom hanoagim nachtocha b'tzalim ve'atznon dak. You're cutting up onions, radishes, very fine. Enim chot be'adam, de'esh lemamash yismochu. Again, we're not getting into that sugya now, but the point is this. Al kol panim asur lasot ad yetziat beit hakneset. When you come home from shul, and that's when you start preparing the food. Not if you were to do it many, many hours before shul, that would not be considered miyad. Okay. Another discussion here which comes up is, what if there's a food that requires a long time? You want your food to marinate or whatever. It takes a long time, the preparation. So technically speaking, I don't need as long, but it's going to improve the taste of the food if I spend a longer time preparing, and therefore I'm doing the borah much earlier. Would that also be considered miyad? So the Shmirat Shabbat in source 14, he says, Shamati Magon Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, the mistaber. You need the onions to be there for a long time, whatever. That's considered immediate as well, because that's the normal way of eating it. He says, Ayen, B'shut Rav Pa'alim. Rav Pa'alim is the Ben Ish Chai. That is the name of his shut. And he says, no, so he says he does not hold this view. Right. So he says, right. So the Ben Ish Chai disagrees with this, but Shmat Shabbat Kilchata says that it's permitted. We just skip to the part which is in bold. He says, Im letzorech hatam regilim tamid lachim letaken to rak 3-4 shot lifnei haseuda. Okay, this is the normal way for this food, that you would always prepare it 3 or 4 hours earlier. So then, shapir mutar livor v'chashiv kederach achila b'kach. That's normal. That's considered the way of eating. Now, another question which the Ben Ish Chai discusses. Okay, so apologies. This is why I got confused before, because this is what I was thinking of. He says like this. Let's say I want to prepare food. I don't need all the food. I'm not going to eat all of it, but you want to give everybody a full bowl in order for it to look respectable, look mechubad. So then he says, are you allowed to, I'm doing the sorting, the peeling, whatever it is, am I allowed to do it for an extra quantity of food, which I only want to prepare that food to look good for the guest, but no one's actually going to eat it? Okay, this reminds us of a certain question that comes up in Hilchot Yom Tov, where, for example, in Yom Tov you're allowed to cook for the sake of Yom Tov. I'm not allowed to cook for Yom Chol. How exacting do I have to be? So the halacha is, a person, you can cook all the food that you need for Yom Tov, but you think you'll need for Yom Tov, and then it might be you have a little bit of extra food. Okay, as long as it wasn't intentional, that's okay. So here the Ben Ish Chai writes as follows in source 15. He says, "Da ki nistapakti baborer shiur lemalot ha'ke'ara kedei la'aniach lefnei ha'orchim la'alta." I want to give everybody a nice salad, or everybody has their own individual salad bowl, and I want the bowl to look full because that's what's going to be mechubad. ויודע הוא שאין האורחים אוכלים כל מה שמניח בקערה, ובוודאי יישאר. But I know I'm going a little bit overboard. Everybody's getting a very large bowl, and nobody's going to finish the food that they have, so they're not going to eat. But in order to impress my guests, okay, I'm going to fill up the bowls. You can't bring somebody a half full bowl, right? That's not kavod. So he says, ברור אצלי, very interesting language. He says, ברור, it's obvious. But how's it obvious? Based on my svara. I don't have a proof for this, but I would think that it's clear that this is acceptable. This is also part of the sake of the meal. This is for the sake of the meal. Okay, well, at the end of the day, everybody needs to have the food in front of them, whether they're going to eat it or not going to eat it, whatever. It's a secondary question, but he says that's part of the Tzorech Achila, and therefore it would be allowed. Shmat Shabbat Kilchata says the same thing. Interestingly, Rav Ovadia Yosef says no. He says at the end of the day, Have a look at the bottom in bold. He says, you have no proof for this. He says, only derech achila means derech achila. Okay. And this is not, and therefore that's not considered for the immediate needs for the meal, because essentially he's saying, when are you going to eat this? You're going to eat it another time later on. That's not immediate. That's not for now. Okay, so those are some of the discussions and some of the chilukim when it comes to the question of miyad, what is considered immediate or not. Now let's talk about what is considered biyad, what is considered with your hand versus with a utensil. So the number one question that everybody asks is, what about cutlery? Okay, I know that we're in Israel and not everybody is knowing to use cutlery, but hopefully in many contexts we find ourselves using knives and forks and spoons. Is that considered sorting, or is that considered using your hand or not? So there is a bit of a stira in the Mishnah Brura. Have a look at source number 17 on page 300. The Mishnah Brura writes as follows. He says, somebody is connecting the fat that floats on top of the milk. Okay, that is also considered bora, that is salting. So if I'm lifting off the fat together with a little bit of the milk, that is going to be permitted. We'll talk about that more next week. This is a case, it's brought in the Taz and brought in others, but the case that the poskim bring is what happened if I had a cup of wine or a cup of juice and there was a fly inside. It's like, am I allowed to remove it? So I'm not actually allowed to remove the fly, because that would be taking the psolet from the ochel. One of the leniencies is if I remove it with a little bit of the juice as well. Okay, most people will probably just pour out the whole cup and refill it. That wasn't always possible. But if I remove together with it, so then I'm not necessarily removing the waste from the food, but I'm removing some of the food together. And this has other applications also. But that's what he says. But now, he says, okay. Now in bold, it says, he says, if you're taking the fat away by itself, even if you want to eat it, that would be forbidden. Why? Because you're taking it with a spoon. And we said we need all three conditions. We need ochel mitoch psolet, we need miyad, and it has to be with your hand, not with a kli. So yeah, you're taking it with a spoon, you're taking it with a kli. That is the Mishnah Berurah in Sif Katan Samach Bet. Now, if we carry on a little bit later in the same siman, Sif Katan Samach Vav, yeah, the Mishnah Berurah quotes a Tosefta. He says that the betosefta ita ava machabetzu masek del rav ochel v'rotze lomar leafrid bakaf machal aveh min harotev de mutar. If I'm using a spoon to separate solid food from liquid, that is mutar. Mishum derech achila bakaf. So hang on a second. If I'm using a spoon, is that considered that I'm using my hand? Is the spoon an extension of my hand, and that is considered derech achila and not derech brera? Or do I say I'm using a kli, I'm using an implement, and even if I have the other conditions, it's going to be forbidden. If I look at source number 17 in the Mishnah Berurah, he says asur. If I look at source number 18, he says mutar. So which is it? Obviously can't be both. Can't both be right? So says Rav Moshe Feinstein, Igros Moshe source number 19, as follows. He says bedavar bolel b'shabbat lechol la'alta ochem mitoch psolet al dei mazleg v'kaf. Regarding this question, when I'm using a fork or a spoon, is that considered my hand or is that considered a kli? In a pashut. Again, this is also pashut and barur. Everybody knows. But he says it's obvious. Laniutati. Dimal yedei amazleg ve'akaf nivral b'nekel mibiado. שנמצא שמסיים למעשה הברירה, יש להחשיב זה כבורר בכלי ויש לאסור. Okay, very, very logical distinction. Says Rav Moshe Feinstein, the question is, what is the fork or the spoon doing? If I'm using the fork or the spoon to separate something, and I wasn't able to separate it with my hand, and that's a system, so I'm using the kli in terms of pork. For example, just you have something that goes, you're trying to get the onion out of your soup, or right, if I just as an example, let's say you have an egg. Sometimes you crack an egg. You're not really going to be doing it on Shabbos because you can't cook the egg. On Yom Tov you could cook the egg, but on Yom Tov you can probably do borer anyway. But just by way of illustration, if I was to let's say I crack an egg, and sometimes, a small piece of the shell goes into the egg as well right before I put it into the pan. So I want to get rid of that piece of the shell. With my hand, it's going to be impossible. But if I take a spoon, it's also going to be impossible, but it will be a little bit easier, right? So there, I'm using the spoon as an implement of borer. I'm using it in order to sift. In the case of the Mishnah Berurah, I'm using the spoon to get the cream out or the fat out from on top of the milk. That would be considered that I'm using the kli to sort, and that would be forbidden. However, if it would have been just as easy or just as difficult to separate it with my hand or not, let's say I'm eating chicken off the bone, something like that, or I've got the chicken skin and the chicken meat, whatever. And then the only reason why am I using the fork, because it's easier to reach, or because I don't want to get my hands dirty, because I'm in polite company, etc. So therefore, the fork is really just an extension of my hand. And therefore, in that case, the general case where I'm just using the cutlery to eat, and that's the normal way of eating, says that would be considered that the cutlery is an extension of my hand. You can see underneath that the Ochot Shabbat says slightly differently. It says he rejects this resolution. He argues using cutlery is usually considered an integral part of eating, and therefore he suggests only actions usually done as part of the process of food production are prohibited when done with cutlery. Right? Source number 20 it says שלקיחת מאכל עבה מהרוטב אפילו בכף יש עליה שם של דרך אכילה, מה שאין כן לקיחת השמנת מגבי החלב, הביא מעשה חשוב בפני עצמו, שהוא עושים אותו בדרך כלל כחלק מהתהליך של יצור החלב והשמנת. This is what am I doing? If what I'm doing now is part of the usual manner of eating, then it doesn't matter if I'm using my hands, my fork, but if it's something else earlier in the process, that would not be. Okay, Rav Ovadia, over the page, source number 21, is even more maker with this. He says essentially that the contributing factor is the utensil that I'm using. Is that a utensil which is used for sorting or not? So a kanan and a tamchwe and an apan kvara, which the Gemara spoke about, these are, a sieve or something like that, is used for sorting. A knife and a fork are not used for sorting, they're used for eating. And therefore, that would never be considered a kli. Okay, what does he do with the Mishnah Berurah? You can argue with the Mishnah Berurah. He says, right, that's source number 21. He says, בדבר שאלה, אם מותר לברור אוכל מתוך פסולת לאתר על ידי כף המזלג, נראה בעיניי שאין בזה משום איסור בורר בכלי. Okay, it says when you're using a spoon or a fork, this is not considered a kli ever. שלא אסור אלא כגון קנון ותמחוי שעומדים לברירה. Only these types of utensils which are actually used for sorting. מה שאין כן בכף או מזלג, שהם דרך אכילה ממש. These are utensils which are used for eating. וכידו אריך דדמי, like an extension of your hand. הן אמת שהמשנה ברורה כתב שאסור לברור בכף או השומן את השומן מן החלב. Says Rabbi, yes, I know what the Mishnah Berurah says. Rabbi learned the Mishnah Berurah thousands of times. He certainly is aware of what he wrote. He says, אפילו לצורך לאכלו לאלתר, and he gave an illustration whereby using the spoon would be forbidden. כיוון שלקחו בכף, אולם אין דבריו מוכרחים. But you can argue with that, says Rabbi. So bottom line is, do we consider the spoon or the cutlery to be an extension of our hand? Do we consider that to be sorting? According to Rav Ovadia, it's always considered an extension of your hand. According to the Mishnah Berurah, it may not be. And as Rav Moshe Feinstein explained, if I'm using that as in order to help me sort or sift or select something else, then I would have to be careful. But if it's just a normal way of eating, using the knife and fork, etc., that would be considered an extension of your hand, and that would not be considered a kli. Okay, and we have the same thing when it comes to, for example, a slotted spoon. 24, the Ochot Shabbat. He says, "Ein lishtamesh bekaf mecholelet l'ntilat salat hamelav b'rotev." Right, so I have salad mixed with dressing and whatever, but I have a slotted spoon. That is a utensil that's used for sorting, to separate the dressing from the food, or to separate the food from the liquid, or whatever. That would be a problem. That would be considered borer. Okay, there are some You see, there are some Sfari poskim a bit more lenient on that, but they also say that it's good to be stringent. I just want to skip forward for a moment to the end of the shiur on page 313. There's a little machshava section. So there's a nice piece here from the Pnei Halacha, which if anybody's interested, we have the whole set of Pnei Halacha in the hard copy downstairs in the Beit Midrash, and you're welcome to avail yourself of those books. But he says one of the things very interesting about Pnei Halacha is it's a halacha sefer, but he likes to bring the ideas behind some halachot as well. So he talks here about the melacha of borer. So this is source 38 on page 313. He says, the truth is, didn't mention, but the Gemara actually says we have three melachot which are almost identical, zoreh, meraked, and borer, which are all different types of sorting and selecting, done in a slightly different way. Because they were all done in the Mishkan, they're brought as three different melachot, but there are a number of similarities between them. But we have a lot of melachot dealing with this idea of separating the psolet from the ochel from the psolet, etc. So he says we can learn from this. The world today is confused and mixed up, if you haven't noticed. In order for us to be able to separate the good from the bad, that allows a person to develop and improve the world. Also, the spiritual work that we have, also in terms of values and morals and on the level of machshava, of ideas, the world is very confused, again, if you haven't noticed. We need to distinguish between good and bad, which, as we've learned, is more difficult than it sometimes seems. If it was obvious and clear where the good was and where the bad was, then it would be easy to choose the good. Within the good, there is also bad, and within the bad, there is good as well. That is essentially, this is what the Rambam writes along these lines at the very beginning of the Moreh Nevuchim. This is connected to the chet of Eitz Hadat, right? That right at the beginning of creation, when Adam and Chava eat from the Eitz Hadat, and then it says they became people who would know Yod Ei Tov Vara. And the Rambam writes in his Moreh Nevuchim, says, I was asked a question by a very wise individual, which is, how could it be that through the sin, through doing that which was prohibited, they actually were elevated? Before that, they were not able to distinguish between Tov and Ra, and now they become creatures distinguishing between Tov and Ra. How can that be? So the answer the Rambam gives, he says there is a difference between Tov and Ra, and Emet and Sheker. He says before the Chet, the world was divided into Emet and Sheker, truth and falsehood. Afterwards, it becomes good and bad. And every good has got a little meaning. That can be sheker, that can be false, which is a little bit good for you, right? Should you eat that piece of cake that's sitting there in the corner? When a person's on a diet, is it good for me? It's not. Is it good? It's good. It's tasty, whatever. But is it really good for you? Is it emet or is it sheker? It's sheker. Okay, that's the difference. We now live in a world where everything is a little bit confused. It's not so simple. It's not so clear all the time to distinguish between tov and ra. If everything was obvious, then there'd be no questions. והאתגר הגדול שהציב הקדוש ברוך הוא בפני האדם הוא שיברר את הטוב מהרע ויעמיד כל דבר במקומו ויתקן בכך את העולם. Our job is to try and distinguish between these, to try and find the tov and separate that from the ra and elevate the tov, etc. So that's an idea which is behind some of the sometimes you look at these melachot and you look at borer, it's one of those questions people say, does God really care if I separate the chicken from the bone or the bone from the chicken? The answer is yes. And maybe part of the deeper understanding behind it is what this melacha represents and what the avodah of borer really means in our lives. Okay, we've discussed two of the three conditions. The third one is ochel mitoch psolet and psolet mitoch ochel. What happens if it's two different types of food as well? What if it's two types of the same food? What if it's big pieces and small pieces, etc.? There's a lot more to talk about over here, but I think we'll stop there for now. We will conclude next week, B'ezrat Hashem. So we're going to have to bring the next set of books because we'll conclude volume 18 and we'll go on to volume 19, which will begin with some more discussion of borer and moving on to the subsequent halachot as well. Ad kan, have a wonderful day, everybody, and have a good week. Is there any problem?